Hi, my name is Brendan Cull and I will be completing this presentation as part of the SBS 6108 unit Physiological Test for Elite Athletes. The primary focus of the presentation will be to review the current testing protocols associated with the AFL Draft Combine, looking at the relative strengths and weaknesses of each based on peer-reviewed research. So just an overview of what the presentation is going to cover. In addition to looking at the testing protocols included with the Draft Combine, I'll be discussing the movement demands, the physiological requirements, and also an injury analysis on Australian rules football. We'll look at how these factors may contribute to selecting appropriate tests for the sport of AFL. I think it's important we start with defining exactly what talent identification is. Vaillens and Loire et al. Define talent identification as the process of identifying persons with potential to excel in their particular sport. As the AFL has become more professional, so has the science around recruitment, and the AFL is always looking for elite talent. Increasingly, they have started to look for talent in other sports such as Gaelic football and basketball. The AFL has held a draft combine, formerly known as the Draft Camp, since 1994. Previous to this, club recruiters relied on players' performances at their local clubs or schools as a means of deciding whether a player was capable of playing at the elite level. US sports such as basketball and American football have had a draft combine for many years, and the AFL has incorporated many of the same tests and processes that the NBA and NFL use. The AFL currently employ the following physical fitness tests: the counter movement jump, the running vertical jump, the 20-metre sprint, the AFL agility test, the yo-yo intermittent recovery test 2, along with some anthropometric testing. Along with the physical and anthropometric tests, skill, reaction time and decision-based tests are also included in the Draft Combine. In a review paper by Burgess and Norton, they outline the importance of including these skill and decision-making tests. They suggest that while some physical tests can assess athletic ability and have some success in predicting future athletic success, most studies on the physical assessment of elite athletes at the adolescent level are cross-sectional and lack developmental relevance. The movement demands of Australian rules footballers have changed significantly over the years. In the last 10 years, there's been a massive shift in how clubs use the interchange bench. A good description of the overall movement demands of the game can be summed up by Dawson and Hopkinson. They describe the movement patterns of Australian rules football as highly intermittent, with repeated bouts of shorter, high-intensity sprinting efforts on a base of lower-intensity walking and jogging. This would be a fairly similar description to many other team sports such as hockey and soccer. In 2005, GPS was introduced into the Australian Football League and has slowly filtered down into the minor leagues. The use of this technology has enabled sports scientists to more easily quantify the demands of the game. A study by Wisby and Montgomery tracked the movement of elite AFL players over 4 years. The major findings of the study were that players spent an average of 100 minutes on the ground per game, covered an average of 12.2 kilometres, had an average of 86 surges per game. Now, surge constituted running at a speed of over 18 kilometres an hour. Players had an average of 246 accelerations per game, where an acceleration constituted an increase in speed of more than 4 kilometres an hour in a 1 second period. And that high intensity running represented 5% of the total time played. Continuing on now with the movement analysis, in a study done on elite AFL players by Augie in 2010, found that high-speed running and overall physical activities are reduced in the fourth quarter when compared to the first quarter. Whilst this finding is not surprising, it is backed up by the findings of Mooney and Cormack, who found a higher score in the yo-yo intermittent recovery test correlated with an ability to maintain high running speeds and withstand fatigue later in games. Taking this into account, any sort of test that helps identify players with an increased aerobic capacity that can withstand fatigue could be beneficial for talent identification. Let's now look at some of the physiological demands of AFL footballers. Historically, heart rate data has been a useful tool when measuring exercise demands and training loads. Back in 1975, Pike and Smith studied the heart rate responses of 2 players, one based in the backline and the other in the midfield. These players were in the South Australian National Football League. We can see here that the midfielder had a higher overall heart rate over the course of the match. The study noted that during intense periods of play, heart rates reached up to 94% of their heart rate maximum. At this intensity, players would most certainly be exercising above their lactate threshold. Heart rate monitoring in conjunction with GPS could be a powerful tool for tracking training loads, as opposed to being utilised for any sort of fitness testing. It has long been recognised that a strong aerobic capacity is a key requirement of successful players. The ability to distribute oxygen efficiently to the muscle tissues allows players to withstand fatiguing mechanisms, especially given the long duration of the game. Typical relative VO2 max values for elite players are in the range of 55 to 65 mils per kilo a minute. These values are much lower than elite endurance athletes such as cross-country skiers, but compare favourably to other team sports. Traditionally, VO2 max has been estimated through maximal aerobic tests such as the 20-metre shuttle run or the beep test, or one of the yo-yo test protocols. A number of researchers, including Pine and Gardner, report that a high VO2 max is a key ingredient for a draftee to be successful at the elite AFL level. Currently, the AFL use the yo-yo intermittent recovery 2 test in their draft combine, which we'll look at in more depth later in the presentation. Given the intermittent nature of Australian rules football, the ability to repeatedly sprint is a key attribute AFL footballers need to possess. Young and Newton found that along with aerobic capacity, repeat sprint ability was a characteristic that set successful elite players apart. A study done by Pine and Saunders looking at factors affecting repeat sprint ability used a 6x30 repeated sprint test on a 20-second cycle. The really interesting finding from the study suggested a strong repeat sprint ability is related to sprint qualities more so than aerobic endurance. This raises some interesting questions in terms of training prescription and what qualities recruiting staff should focus on. The 6x30 repeat sprint test was removed from the AFL Draft Combine in 2017. The AFL felt, with the increased load on draft hopefuls in that period of the year, that the repeat sprint test placed the fitness of some players in jeopardy. According to the AFL website, it caused the most amount of soft tissue injuries of all the tests. It is important to point out that there was no data available on how many injuries had occurred due to the 6x30 repeat sprint test over the years. Given the undeniable importance of AFL players to repeat sprint, the decision to exclude it from the draft combine is questionable. Strength, power and speed are key fitness components of AFL, and indeed most team sports. Speed and power are tested in the draft combine through the 20-metre sprint and vertical jump tests. However, there is no test for maximal strength. The bench press has not been included since the year 2000, and a lower body strength test such as a leg press or squat has never been included. Perhaps this is due to a lot of underage players not being exposed to well-designed resistance programs and do not possess the necessary expertise to execute these lifts. Not surprisingly, Young and Newton found the 3-rep max bench press and leg press were far superior in AFL senior players when compared to elite juniors. Given that strength underpins all other fitness components, it may be time to introduce some sort of max strength test and also devote more resources into elite underage resistance training. The counter movement jump has long been used to test leg power. Pine and Gardner reported that elite players drafted into the AFL system had significantly better jumping and agility abilities when compared to those that weren't drafted. Whilst there is a lack of data examining the number of times players jump in a game, there is no doubt the ability to jump when marking, spoiling and contesting is an extremely important component of the game of AFL. Young, Cormack and Crichton evaluated the relationships between counter movement jump variables and acceleration, along with maximum speed performance in 23 elite players. Results indicate there was a moderate correlation between counter movement jump height and 10-metre times. Additionally, Cormack and Newton concluded that counter movement jump can provide a protocol for monitoring neuromuscular fatigue in elite players. Based on these and many other studies, the counter movement jump is essential as a talent identification testing protocol for power. I will discuss the counter movement jump in more detail later in the presentation. Australian rules football is a game that requires dynamic change of direction, jumping, kicking, as well as collisions. A review by Harisa Marlis found that the most prevalent injuries associated with AFL are muscle strains, ligament sprains, hematomas and concussion. Hematomas and concussion are often the result of a collision contact with an opponent or teammate and consequently can be categorised as extrinsic or environmentally related. Extrinsic or environment related injuries cannot really be detected through any sort of screening process. The focus of this presentation will be to review injuries that are modifiable or intrinsic athlete related. Given that the AFL is a multi-million-dollar business, any screening protocols through their talent identification process that may help detect injuries and inform training processes are desirable. The three main categories we are going to look at in this injury analysis section are the hamstrings, the groin and the lower leg region, inclusive of the ankle and knee. There has been a significant amount of research going into hamstring injuries over the years. Chumanov and Shaki suggest that when hamstrings are loaded eccentrically, it puts an athlete at risk of injury. When an athlete is sprinting at the terminal swing phase, the hamstrings are acting eccentrically to decelerate hip flexion and knee extension. A screening test which ascertains eccentric flexion, eccentric extension strength ratios may be beneficial in identifying athletes susceptible to hamstring injuries. Harusamalis reports that classic hamstring flexibility tests such as the sit and reach, toe touch, active knee extension and passive straight leg raise have been found to have no association with hamstring injuries. A possible explanation could be attributed to the fact that the hamstrings are not at the end of their functional range during these tests. Skase and Marjorie reported that ankle injuries are one of the most prevalent in Australian rules football. Despite this, few studies have examined risk factors for attaining an ankle injury. Knee injuries, in particular ACL ruptures, are one of the most prevalent serious injuries resulting in time lost playing and training. Harusamalis and McLaughlin examined low balanceability and its relationship with ankle and knee injuries in elite Australian rules footballers. Low scores on this test were associated with an increased likelihood of ankle injuries, but no association was made with knee injuries. Perhaps some sort of lower leg balance test might be worth considering in our talent identification program. Orchard and Seward reports that groin injuries have become more prevalent in the last decade. As a result, increased resources have been utilised to develop screening protocols that may help in identifying athletes at greater risk of attaining a groin-related injury. Crowe and Pearce found that a reduced range of movement of the hip joint placed significant tension on the pubic region, which in turn may contribute to overall groin complications. It is important to note that although some of the tests discussed here identified a correlation between risk factor and injury, the tests do not necessarily mean causality. Inclusion or exclusion of basic injury screen tests as part of a broader talent identification program requires further investigation. Some other interesting literature associated with injuries in AFL football included a study by Chalmers and Marjorie, who looked at the relationship between pre-season fitness testing and injury in elite junior Australian footballers. They found an association between poor aerobic ability and lower leg injuries. This finding would certainly support the inclusion of a max aerobic ability test. Chalmers and Marjorie also found that elite underage players with faster 5-metre acceleration and agility times were more susceptible to injuries in the knee, hip, thigh and groin areas. Taking this into account, frequent monitoring of players who display these traits would be worthwhile to prevent injuries associated with the knee, hip and groin. In support of the work done by Chalmers and Marjorie, Gaston and Mayer found that a greater aerobic capacity and increased lean body mass were protective factors against injury. Identification of lean body mass and aerobic fitness is easily determined through talent identification, and weaknesses in either of those areas could be addressed through appropriate training interventions. The first of the fitness testing protocols associated with the draft combine we're going to look at is the counter movement jump. Let's have a look at the counter movement jump in action now. Currently, the AFL Draft Combine does not use a force plate. If it were, the following variables would be able to be measured. We've got peak force, relative peak force, peak power, peak velocity, rate of force development, and impulse. Young and Cormack did a study in 2011 entitled "Which Jump Variables Should Be Used to Assess Explosive Leg Muscle Function?" The study involved 23 elite AFL players. Various kinetic and kinematic variables were recorded. They found that a forced platform is desirable when measuring counter movement jump variables. Jump height and peak power per body weight are useful variables to describe leg muscle explosive function for athletes who perform sprints. So let's have a look at some of the data here. In terms of jump height, we can see a moderate correlation there with the 10-metre sprint. Peak velocity has a moderate correlation there when over 20 to 40 metres. And peak power per body weight, when we're taking body weight into consideration, there's a moderate correlation there for the 10 metre, but over 20 to 40 metres there's a large correlation. Some interesting data there for the counter movement jump. We will now move on to the running vertical jump, and let's have a look at the running vertical jump in action. Whilst there is a lack of research around the running vertical jump, it is undeniable that it does replicate what happens in game situations such as jumping for a mark, spoiling, or in a ruck contest. The one study that did have some reference to the running vertical jump was done by Woods and Rayner, and they found that high scores in a combination of a standing vertical jump, standing height, and aerobic capacity test was a strong indicator of identifying talent. These characteristics are often associated with basketballs and could explain why a number of good basketballers have made the transition to AFL in recent times, including Mason Cox from Collingwood and Hugh Greenwood from the Adelaide Crows. Let's now move on to the 20-metre sprint in action. Let's have a look at it here. When doing any sort of short distance testing, it is really important to use timing gates for reliability purposes. Within the game of AFL, numerous studies have shown that actual sprint time within games lasts less than 3 seconds, which makes a 20-metre sprint a must for any talent identification program. If we look at the data here by Pine, Sheen and Hopkins, we can see the sprint times of those players who were drafted were quicker over 5, 10 and 20 metres when we compare those to players that were not drafted. Importantly, the study found that the difference between the groups was significant in that it was greater than the smallest worthwhile change. We're going to now move on to the yo-yo test, and again we'll have a quick look at the yo-yo test in action for part of it.
Exiting wrong. Exiting 2.
The yo-yo test replaced the beep test, or the 20-metre shuttle run in 2017, primarily because it replicated what happened in games more closely, due to its intermittent nature. Veal and Pearce evaluated the ability of the yo-yo intermittent recovery test to distinguish intermittent endurance between performance differences between elite junior Australian rules footballers, sub-elite junior Australian rules footballers, and a group of non-athletic healthy aged matched males. The results of the study found that the yo-yo test was able to easily distinguish intermittent endurance ability between the three groups tested, with the elite group running on average 432 metres further than the sub-elite group and 1,136 metres further than the non-athletic group. If we have a look at the p-values here, we can see that these results represent a significant difference between each of the three groups. We are now going to discuss the AFL agility test. But is it a true test of agility? We will discuss more after having a look at the test in action. Some sports scientists would argue that it is not a true agility test, as the participants know the outlay of the course prior to undertaking the test. Therefore, it could be regarded as more of a change of direction test, along with speed. Young and Farrow suggest a true agility test should contain some unknown variable which ideally should be specific to the sport. A great deal of thought would need to go into devising a test that matches the agility demands of Australian rules footballers. For reliability purposes, it would be difficult to include a stimulus such as a football. Hart and Spiteri also suggest that the test should be undertaken bilaterally to allow for dominant leg preferences of different athletes. Currently, this is not adhered to in the draft combine. At the very least, the AFL might like to consider changing the name of its current agility test. The size and dimensions of players is an important component of any talent identification regime. Anthropometric data can help ascertain appropriate playing positions and also formulate management of dietary and training practices. The anthropometric data collected at the AFL Draft Combine includes height, body mass, sum of skin folds, arm length and hand span. Let's have a look at some data collected by Veal in 2011. We can see here there are significant differences between elite juniors and AFL seniors when we're looking at weight, lean mass, fat mass, bone mass and bone mineral density. If we now have a look over at this table, we can see that there are significant differences between percentage body weight in terms of lean mass, and also when we look at fat mass we can see that there are significant differences between total fat mass and fat mass as a percentage of body weight. Some key things to think about when considering anthropometric data is that Keogh reported the biggest adaptation needed by junior players to play AFL was to increase muscle mass. Young and Newton reported that body mass did not differentiate between successful and unsuccessful players, and that Young and Price suggest that the hand span was not an indicator of future success. In wrapping up my presentation, I'm just going to touch on some of the key points. The first one is that the demands of the games are continually changing. We need to think about whether the current testing protocols are most appropriate, and we always need to think about can they be improved or do they need changing. The second dot point here, I've got subjective measures such as game performance and skills testing are still very important for talent identification. If a 17 or 18 year old can't get their hands on the football, if they can't kick it, then they're not going to be able to play at the elite level. So these measures are still very important. The next point we've got here is that a max strength test might be useful to include in the future. Strength underpins everything. So whether it's a maximal bench press or perhaps a lower leg strength test could be a useful inclusion in future draft combines. When administering the counter movement jump, I believe the AFL should consider the use of a force plate. When using a force plate, excellent kinetic and kinematic values can be gained. This can then guide training into the future. Finally, the AFL specific agility test could be refined so that it tests more than just change of direction and speed. Some other stimulus related to the game of AFL could be included to make it a more true agility test. Finally, I'd like to thank you for watching this presentation, and please find all the references that I've used that has guided this presentation.